On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to talk about the architectural design of Washington, D.C. We're going to look at the obelisk of the Washington Monument and the various statues around the buildings of Washington, D.C. It's kind of interesting that you don't see very many crosses in Washington, but you see all of these symbols of ancient Egyptian mythology and Greek mythology and Roman mythology. And of course, all this comes from a DVD called Riddles in Stone, The Secret Architecture of Washington, D.C. It's something that every American needs to understand. No need for it to be a secret any longer. We're moving quickly toward a new world order. And we need to understand why such a world order could be done. You can see the architectural design of even the streets of Washington, D.C. Well, the author, the writer and director of this DVD, along with The Secret Mysteries of America's Beginnings, The New Atlantis, is with us today, Chris Pinto, and Gary Stearman is here. We're going to have a great time. Gary, let's start off with the first question.
Well, and welcome to Prophecy in the News, Chris Pinto.
Good. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. Now, Riddles in Stone is a documentary, and essentially it documents the statuary, the architecture, the angles of the streets and avenues in Washington, D.C. Amazingly, they all have a message that takes us back into the ancient pagan world. Now, this is a fascinating story. The angles, the streets and avenues of Washington, D.C., in essence, comprise a kind of sacred geometry. And that goes back to ancient Greece, Chris.
Yeah, and to the philosopher Pythagoras, who was kind of the, Pythagoras lived thousands of years ago, but he was the philosopher who was embraced. His ideas were being embraced by the guys who brought about the French Revolution, starting in Bavaria with the Bavarian Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt, who had founded that group. He actually wrote extensively about Pythagoras. And Dr. James Billington, in his book Fire in the Minds of Men, who writes about that period. Billington's the Librarian of Congress, for those who don't know. But he has a whole segment in there called the Pythagorean Passion, and how these revolutionaries had this passion for Pythagoras, and they used his symbols and his ideas on numbers, and believing that numbers and geometric shapes had an inner occult secret meaning, and so on. And these ideas were embraced by the people who brought about this whole revolutionary era. And one of them, a guy named Pierre L'Enfant, who was the chief architect who designed the street layout for Washington, D.C., came from France. He came from the environment where these ideas were being put forth. And of course, Thomas Jefferson, who influenced the design for Washington, D.C., he had spent 5 years in France as the U.S. ambassador there, and was very involved with those who brought about the French Revolution. And so it seems that even though they didn't necessarily lay out a specific description of why they designed the city the way that they did, you find the Pythagorean symbols throughout the city. A lot of people will talk about the pentagram north of the White House, or they'll talk about the right triangle, the L'Enfant triangle. Both of those are Pythagorean symbols.
Now, in school, we studied the Pythagorean theorem in geometry class, and it seems perfectly harmless. You know, you can use it to build with, and it's a very useful piece of knowledge. But Pythagoras took it a step further into the upper strata as a spiritual idea. And in essence, that spiritual idea pervades Washington, D.C., at least according to those who archive these things, those who have made a study. And Chris, you've brought together the bits and pieces of this in your DVD. What is this overlying knowledge, this esoteric knowledge that we're talking about here?
Collectively, it's the same as the ancient Egyptians were doing with the pyramids and the designs of their cities and monuments and so on. It's linking the city of Washington, D.C. with the stars. That's a short description of what they were doing. They were trying to build the city in alignment with certain star configurations and so on, because they believed that by doing so, they would draw down spiritual power from the heavens to empower that city to be successful and to do great things and so on.
Wow.
And I mean, this is the belief of architecture throughout the ancient world. And it was this same belief that was brought into the design of Washington, D.C.
So we have the meridian lines around the globe. You can even see them as we've had them on the map behind us here. And we have the latitude and the longitude lines. And I noticed that 5 cities from Washington, D.C. through Boston were lined up in a straight line with what goes right through Stonehenge in England. So this was done by design, was it not?
Well, that's the belief. That's the belief. Again, there are no official records. Nobody sat down and said, yes, we lined up the cities this way. But that research in particular comes from James Allison, who's been acknowledged at an international level for his ideas on these ley lines and these circles that go around the globe and that connect, so he believes, these ancient monuments. But the patterns that he comes up with are fascinating. And what we show in the series is how those 5 early Revolutionary War cities, you know, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., they all line up in a straight line, and if you follow that line across the Atlantic Ocean, it takes you all the way to Stonehenge.
Wow.
Which the early founders would have had knowledge of, certainly, especially those that were involved with Sir Francis Bacon and Dr. John Dee, who inspired the early some of the early colonists.
Let's just take one feature and tell me about the Washington Monument, this obelisk, which for all the world looks Egyptian. What's it doing there? And what's the story behind that?
Well, it was originally designed to be kind of a Greco-Roman Egyptian colonnade, where they were going to have this big colonnade of Revolutionary War heroes around it. There was an obelisk that had kind of a flat top on it, and then Washington was going to be on there riding on a chariot, you know, and that was going to celebrate George Washington. And then the different monument committees argued and fought about it for years. The Civil War happened. They had built up only like the first third or so of the obelisk itself and nothing else, and it was unfinished for several decades. And then after the Civil War, they put the committee together again, and they got in touch with an American ambassador who was over in Italy. And he was studying the obelisks that the Romans had brought in from Egypt, the original Egyptian obelisks. And it's from him that he said to them things like, you know, get rid of, the famous quote is, get rid of all the gingerbread, you know, and leave only the obelisk. And so they got rid of the colonnade and the statue of Washington and so on, and just made a straight obelisk so that it would conform more to the Egyptian model. And it was from this ambassador that he told them that an obelisk should be 10 times the height of the base. And that's where the height, the 550 feet and so on, comes from. So,
and no other building, I think, in Washington, D.C. can be higher than that. Is that right?
I believe that's right. Now, I haven't documented that, but that's the understanding that I have.
On the dome of the Capitol building, there's a statue of a woman. Tell us about her.
That is the Statue of Freedom, and she symbolizes all of the goddess image that we have throughout the city. And that's a very popular image to do. The Statue of Liberty is a different type of Lady Freedom. Initially, however, right now she's got these stars that are crowned on her head. But initially they were going to adorn her with what is called a Phrygian cap. And that was the cap that was worn by the French revolutionaries. It's the red cap that flops over to the side. And for them, it represented a very radical kind of approach to the revolution and the fight for freedom. But that was it again, if you study the Phrygian cap and its use, you find this division, one that we've talked about in the series, in America, about those who believed in a more traditional approach and those who had more of a radical and progressive approach. And that's one of those areas where that came about on that Phrygian cap.
Amazing.
J.R., speaking of statuary, we all hear about Supreme Court. where justice is meted out. And a great deal of importance is assigned to the Supreme Court these days, but Chris tells me that there are the statues of 3 personages adorning the Supreme Court building. That was most fascinating to me because of what they symbolize.
Yeah, over one of the entrances, they've got a tympanum there, and you have the image of Moses holding the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. And then on one side, you have Solon, the ancient Greek lawgiver, who is the central figure in Plato's account of Atlantis. The Atlantis dialogue is all based upon a journey that Solon had taken thousands of years ago to ancient Egypt, and there he learned about the lost empire of Atlantis and so on. And he brought that story back, and it was eventually set down by Plato. So you've got Moses, then you have Solon, and then next to Moses you have Confucius, the ancient Chinese philosopher. And all 3 of these figures are central to the secret societies. In particular, Freemasonry quotes Confucius in some of their, because Confucius made reference to the square and the compass, to the plumb line, and how the actions of a man should be measured against these Masonic implements and so on, that go back, well back into the ancient world. And so Freemasons claim Confucius as one of their early esoteric philosophers. The secret societies also claim Moses. They believe that Moses, the Moses of the Bible, is a somewhat different figure. They believe that God gave certain ideas and laws to Moses that were for the regular people, and those are set down in the Bible, in the Old Testament. But then he took Moses aside, supposedly, and gave Moses these secret doctrines that he didn't tell to anybody else. And this is what Kabbalists and those who believe in these occult doctrines, this is what they believe about Moses today. And then, of course, with Solon, you get the stories of ancient Atlantis. So those 3 figures in particular hold special significance to the secret societies.
Wow. Now, you also mentioned something that's fascinating, and that is the cornerstones in the city of Washington, D.C. Every building has a cornerstone, very important buildings in Washington, D.C. All the cornerstones in that city seem to have one thing in common. And what would that be?
Well, they were all laid by Freemasons. And in fact, we show at the beginning of Riddles in Stone, we talk about the Freemasons, and we try to do so in a respectful but honest manner. But we show the ceremony, the recreation of the laying of the cornerstone for the U.S. Capitol. And there was this big parade of Freemasons that came out. And we show the video of it. We got permission from the society that had videotaped this years ago. And they relay the cornerstone, and they put the corn, the wine, and the oil on each of the stones. And this is the ceremony as they conduct it. But they've done this not only for the cornerstone of the Capitol, but for every major building in Washington, D.C.
Now, why would this be? And tell us about the corn, the wine, and the oil. That's interesting.
I think it really represents the duality that you get in Masonry and all of the secret societies. Because the corn, the wine, and the oil in the Old Testament is written about, and it's part of the sacrifice that God's people brought forth, and they would dedicate that unto the Lord. Okay? But at the same time, when they turned aside to idolatry and would worship Baal, they would also dedicate corn, wine, and oil to Baal. And God reproves the people for doing that. They gave corn, wine, and oil to Baal to worship him. So the question that we ask in Riddles in Stone, when the Masons lay the corn, wine, and the oil on the cornerstone, what God are they dedicating it to? Is it the God of the Bible, or is this really a dedication to Baal?
J.R., I found it really fascinating that Chris took some shots of statuary around Washington, D.C., and there are statues or busts or adornments on the sides of buildings that seem to resemble the historic representations of Baal. And some of them even have corn or ears of corn on their heads, which kind of ties the whole thing together.
Now, if you'll go back in history, you'll find that the Romans had all kinds of statuary around the city of Rome, And wherever they went, they built these magnificent buildings with statues to the various gods. We're reminded that Antiochus IV Epiphanes put a statue of Zeus on the Temple Mount, which the Jewish rabbis called the abomination of desolation. And when Hadrian the Roman destroyed the city of Jerusalem, he erected a statue of Zeus again on the temple grounds. And and in the book of Revelation, we have this statue that's going to be erected on the Temple Mount in the future during the tribulation period, which could again be another statue of Zeus. But Zeus is more than just a symbol. He is an ancient Greek god. He was the king of the gods. His more Latin name would be Jupiter. And so we recognize the planets, but the planets are only symbols of the Greek gods who came down in Genesis chapter 6 to inhabit the earth and establish themselves on and around Mount Hermon, began to marry human women and produce all kinds of strange monstrosities. Even among the animals, we have giant animals, giant beavers, giant buffalo, and these are among the bones found in the dinosaur fields. So not only do we have dinosaurs and ancient, strange chickens that are 6 feet tall, but we have beavers that are 10 feet long and buffalo that are 10 times the size of modern buffaloes. And these had to come from some kind of ancient genetic manipulation. And in these days, we've had this same genetic manipulation going on again with the Human Genome Project. And so it looks like we're all coming down to the final days of this world when Jesus will come and solve the problems that beset mankind, because all of these esoteric ideas keep bringing on wars. And it's going to bring the world down to another world war and finally to the Battle of Armageddon. And the main idea is get rid of the Jews. Get rid of the Jews and establish world government utopia without the chosen people or the God of the chosen people.
So what you're talking about is the creating of a bogus kingdom, I guess. In other words, there is a kingdom mentioned in the Bible. There is another kingdom that's being sought after by men of this world. What the Bible refers to it as the world system. I guess you could say, in a way, today the capital of the world system would have to be Washington, D.C., probably the most powerful focal point on the planet would have to be Washington, D.C., and right there in the middle of it is all of that sacred geometry. This is really amazing to me.
Yeah, I mean, the going back to the idea of America as the new Atlantis, as we talked about with part 1, the original idea of Atlantis was that it was an empire that ultimately extended to all the world. And so the new Atlantis, you know, when President Bush was he was quoted some time ago for saying that he believed that America was an idea but without borders. And so if you ask, okay, well, if America has no borders, then where would it end? It wouldn't end. It would go all the way around the world. And that's certainly the concept of Atlantis. That's the way Manly P. Hall had written about it. I think that's certainly the vision that Sir Francis Bacon had. And Washington, D.C. is really built to reflect all of those Atlantean concepts and ideas, because the entire ancient mystery religion, all of it, is said to have its origin in ancient Atlantis. And so that's what I think is being reflected in Washington, D.C., certainly.
You know, if it strikes me, J.R., if you're a Christian, and if you watch this DVD, it's called Riddles in Stone. You can order it. J.R. will tell you how in just a minute. If you watch this DVD as a Christian, it had the effect on me, I think it'll have the effect on our viewers, of solidifying my faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. I know which side I'm on. And if I know there's another side out there working in their own way, busily working to establish another kingdom, it really solidifies my own personal belief in the Lord.
You know, I have a book here called Morals and Dogma, and it was written by Albert Pike, whose photograph is right here at the beginning of the book. And he was, this book, Morals and Dogma, is the Bible of the secret societies. And this is what he says. Lucifer is the light bearer. Lucifer, the son of the morning. It is he who bears the light. Doubt it not.
Mm.
And so what they want to do, what our politicians in Washington, D.C. want to do, is to get rid of the church, to get rid of Christianity. You know, the ACLU is always against crosses, but they're not against these obelisks of Egypt, the Statue of Liberty or Freedom on top of the Capitol building, or the Statue of Liberty in New York City. They're just against the church. They just want to get rid of Jesus. In fact, they can pray to God, but just don't mention Jesus, you know. And many times when someone is asked to recite a prayer at some political gathering, they will have a moment of silence just so they don't pray in the name of Jesus, you know. Or they can pray to Allah, or some kind of generic prayer that doesn't say we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. That is against the rules in today's modern society. The politically correct thing is to get rid of Jesus, get rid of Jesus Christ, get rid of the Christian church, get rid of evangelism or evangelistic thinking, and just go to another God. God is God. But wait a minute. Their God is Lucifer. I read it to you right here on page 321 of Morals and Dogma. And so he says, doubt it not, for traditions are full of divine revelations and inspirations. This is the Pythagorean geometric design. They think developed evolutionary thinking, but in reality it shows, geometry shows intelligent design. And that there was a God who created this world.
Indeed. Well, who is the great geometrician? Well, we think it's the Lord.
Yeah, Jesus.
Absolutely.
He spoke the worlds into existence.
He spoke the worlds into existence, and his geometry is the foundation of everything. And of course, as God told Job, you know, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?
Yeah.
Job
Amen.
couldn't answer that question. Chris, in Riddles in Stone, you do something interesting. You get both sides of the issue. I notice you interview people on both sides of the question. Is this really a valid way to look at the city of Washington, D.C.? You gather some experts who say no, some who say yes. I think it makes an interesting presentation.
Yeah, we specifically, we tried to create we took sort of a History Channel type approach with the work, so that we could get people who wrote about these issues extensively. And we interview some of the leading experts in America and the world on these debates. We interviewed Dr. Brent Morris, who is a 33rd degree Mason, and he appears on the History Channel, appears on the Discovery Channel, PBS. We interviewed Dr. Robert Hieronymus, who's considered the leading expert on the Great Seal of the United States, and he often appears on these same channels and so on. His work is used by the United States government and around the world. But these are people who object to some of the, you know, to the idea that there is this secret occult design to Washington, D.C. But we went and we talked to them in person, asked them, you know, sent them the questions in advance, and allowed them to respond to a lot of the assertions that are made. We even get the Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge in British Columbia. But anyway, so you can hear, so an audience can hear from their own mouths what these men really believe. And you can see that we're not making this up. You know, the things that they acknowledge on camera are, you know, they're jaw-dropping and eye-opening quite often.
Wow.
You know, Gary, this has been an interesting program. It's something that's not easy to talk about, but it's something that God's people need to understand as we approach the coming one world government.
Well, just as I said a moment ago, it had the effect there of building my faith. If I know that there are people out there planning this sort of thing, it makes me want to redouble my efforts towards serving the Lord. Chris, thanks a lot for the message.
Thank you.
As you know, the things that are written in the book of Revelation don't just happen to pop up one day and say, oh, this is just a natural development of the way things. No, it's all laid out in advance.
Yeah.
Book of Revelation. Well, trust in the Lord. This is J.R. Church and Gary Sturman. Until next time, keep looking up.